Sure. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for showing up at this meeting. My connection to Zoom is a little bit iffy today, but hopefully I'll be able to run it here. So welcome. So as Renee already said, we're going to talk about Arctic refined modeling. That is a very brand new capability, basically, that hopefully will be very useful for studying Arctic processes. So traditionally, if you wanted to do high resolution modeling in the Arctic, you either had the choice of doing a regional model in which you would be ignoring all the connections between the Arctic Earth system and the rest of the globe, or you would be doing high resolution global high resolution modeling, in which you would be spending a lot of computational efforts in regions that you might not be interested in and that might not actually be relevant for the Arctic processes. So now with these regionally refined modeling capabilities, you are able to do climate modeling, Earth system modeling in a global context, but put your resolution where you really want it in the Arctic. So today we'll have two presentations by Milena and Colin to talk about, first of all, the ocean sea ice aspects perspective on regional refined modeling, and Colin will present an atmospheric perspective on regionally refined modeling using the CESM model. After that, we have maybe 15 minutes or so for discussion to talk about the challenges and the opportunities that this new approach will present us. So with that, let's hand it over to Milena.
Okay, you can still hear me, right? So share screen.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you can see my presentation?
Yeah.
How does it look?
Yeah, we can see. Well, I can see the whole screen.
Okay.
Me too.
So I will try to be on time. I have about 40 slides. So I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present this new work, which was done under HiLAT RASM. So I would like to also acknowledge my collaborators. There's a group of us under HiLAT RASM between Los Alamos and the Naval Postgraduate School working on this. There's also a group of people like Mark Peterson, who work at LANO and who have helped us basically making the first configuration of the ocean and the sea ice mesh. And then we have Erica Resler from Sandia National Lab, who has been collaborating with us recently. So for anybody who's not familiar with the GSM, it stands for Energy Exascale Earth System Model, and it's the relatively new, not very new anymore, recently funded DOE Earth System Model. So the main objective for HiLAT RASM is to develop this Arctic focus EGSM configuration, and HiLAT stands for High Latitude Application and Testing. And for phase 2, we have partnered with the RASM project, hence this acronym. So the main charge here is to investigate exchange processes between the high latitudes and the mid latitudes that are critical for the high latitudes roles in the global system. So to just mention some important science questions for our project, we care about the Arctic freshwater budget, its variability, and its export into the North Atlantic, also impact on possible impact on the MOC. We also care about meridional heat transport in and out of the Arctic by both the ocean and the atmosphere, and possible modulation due to sea ice variability. We care about feedbacks associated with this heat transport, cloud feedbacks, and so on and so forth. So keeping these questions in mind, we have developed this EGSM Arctic configuration. And so in this talk, I will describe the configuration, and I will also describe the results of the atmospheric forcing simulations that we have now. I would also welcome a discussion at some point towards questions at the end of the talk for anything that you think we could improve upon for our future simulations. So E3SM adopts for ocean and sea ice, for the ocean sea ice model components, it uses the unstructured model for prediction across scales and past model. And we are currently using two different and past meshes. One we call the 60 to 10 because the lowest resolution is 60 kilometers and the highest resolution in the Arctic is 10 kilometers. So just to give you an idea how the resolution changes, I have this plot here, just ignore this curve. But the double bump represents how the resolution changes with latitude in the lower resolution everywhere E3SM. For us, we have the same resolution bearing in the southern hemisphere, but then in the northern hemisphere, we go from 30 kilometers at the equator to then 10 kilometers north of 60 north. And this transition changes between the Atlantic and the Pacific. We tend to transition more gradually in the Atlantic, and this allows us to have a resolution of at least 20 kilometers in this area of the Gulf Stream. 10 kilometer resolution is inside this oval here. The other mesh is called the 60 to 6, and it's, the change in resolution with latitude is similar to the 60 to 10, but instead of going to 10 kilometers, we go to 6 kilometers in the Arctic region. And this is, as a reference, this is the difference in number of cells between the two meshes. In terms of, I just wanted to show some quick plots of how the hexagon cells look like in the Canadian archipelago. So how we nicely represent some of these passages. And this is the same for the Beaufort Gyre. So I wanted to mention that as far as I'm aware, and please let me know if the other things that I should be aware of, there are two more unstructured models that are being used for Arctic regional refinement. And so one is for ocean. So one is the European finite element ocean sea ice model, which is FISM. And one is a parallel E3SM effort that has a higher resolution around all of the North Atlantic continent and the Arctic as well. So, so the simulations that we have for now are atmospheric forced. So the atmosphere is not varying actively. We call them ocean sea ice, OC. And the atmospheric forcing product is a JRA55DO product version 2, which covers the period 1958 to 2016. And we have three main simulations. So each of the simulation is 3 cycles of JRA55 cycles, one after the other. One for the 60 to 10, one for the 60 to 6, and then we have an extra 60 to 10, which has a modified sea ice parameter with respect to the control to try to investigate some sensitivities to Arctic sea ice thickness. And each of these simulations have last for a total of 177 years, the 3 cycles. So what I will present sometimes series for both 60 to 10 and 60 to 6. But for the climatology, I'm only focusing on the 60 to 10. So we are interested in fluxes, exchanges between the Arctic and the subpolar oceans. So one of the first metrics that we looked at is volume transport across the main gateways, as well as estimates of heat transport and freshwater flux across the same gateways. So here I'm only presenting the volume transport. And for the 5 openings, Fram Strait, Barents Sea openings, Bering, Lancaster Sound, and Nares Strait. So each plot has the black line is a 1-year running average of from the 60 to 10. The red is from the 60 to 6, and the green is shading is basically observational variability that I pulled out from literature. So the 2 purple lines just indicate the cycles, the JRA55 cycles, that we go from one cycle to the other. So as you can see, things to notice are that positive numbers are into the Arctic. The values, the variability is within the observational range, which is good. The other thing is that you don't really see a lot of differences between the 60:10 and 60:6. This was a little bit surprising, but it's something to keep in mind in terms of how to refine resolution. So in terms of, we also looked at heat fluxes and freshwater flux, and from the places where I have observations, we are also pretty good there. There's only the Bering Strait that we seem to have a reduced influx of heat through Bering Strait for some reason. So to look a little bit closer about how the sections look like, I have this plots of vertical sections. There's velocity at the top, and this is for the 60:10. Velocity normal to the section, temperature and salinity. This is only for Fram Strait, just to be quick. So, and this is, so basically the idea is that, so we know that the net volume flux is out of the Arctic here, but the exchanges are very important, right? So we have modified Atlantic water that comes into the West Spitsberg current. We have the fresh water coming out through the East Greenland current. So it's important to represent these fluxes. So I pulled out some observations from papers. And so this is a plot of normal velocity and temperature from Bezinska, Muller et al. 2012. And this is an observational climatology of over the year 2000 to 2009, I believe. This climatology for the ocean is the last 12 years of the full simulation. So for salinity, I'm comparing from, I think it says one summer month for one particular year from the Rudol's 2012 paper. So it is interesting that I think we are representing pretty well the structures, the vertical structures of the currents. And we have a good West Spitsberg current, a little bit weaker East Greenland current, and perhaps the warm, the 3 degrees expands more into the eastern part of the section. But I think that's a pretty decent representation. So another thing that I wanted to do was compare to other E3SM simulations, just to have a little bit of an idea how we're doing with the regional refinement. And so I have, we only have one global high resolution E3SM simulation. We have several for the low resolution. So it's important to emphasize that this is not an apple-to-apple comparison, because the simulations were done independently, they are coupled. So they can be very different from what we have here. But just to give an idea, of course, with the low resolution E3SM, we're not representing the West Spitsberg current very well. It's too wide. It encompasses a lot of depth ranges, and there is this fresh polar water over the top everywhere. For the high resolution, of course, the structure is much better, even though there is this kind of high salinity core that should be investigated. Okay, so these are for the exchanges and the gateways. Now for the Arctic proper, I have like 3 metrics that I would like to show you. One is stratification, one is freshwater content, and one is sea ice. Okay, so this is stratification for winter and salinity and temperature, and it's average over the whole Arctic basin. So the blue and black lines are from the model. It's just 2 different climatologies. One is earlier in the 3rd cycle of the last cycle, and one is later, so the last 12 years. So the last 12 years is like 2005 to 2016. And then the light purple is PHC climatology, and the dark purple is WOA 18 climatology. So that's now when you're starting to see the biases. So for example, salinity below 100 meters, we're doing good, but above that is too fresh. Temperature, the Atlantic water level, water layers are too warm. And this warmer, you know, it's getting more warmer as we get into the simulation. So I would like to emphasize that these biases, like fresher upper ocean, warmer subsurface, are seen, I've seen them in other EGSM simulations for the high latitudes. There is some recent development for improving mesoskeletal parameterizations in the impasse ocean, which we are not in, they were not included in the simulation, but which could improve results in regions where eddies are parameterized and not resolved. So that's something that we can consider for the future. So for Arctic freshwater content, it's also very important quantity for us. This is a time series from the 60 to 10, and it's computed in the Beaufort gyre with respect to the typically used salinity reference of 34.8. And it's compared to recently published results from Proshutinsky et al. 2019, and you have to look at the blue bars here. So first thing that I would like to you to notice is that in terms of values for in the first cycle, we are doing very well. So we have values between 16 and about 25 10 to the cube kilometers cube, which is very comparable to the observed values. Then we tend to trend a little bit. There's a trend which is less kind of trends less in the third cycle, but still there. And so what I believe it is, this is due to trending of salinity, Arctic salinity, which is also consistent with the model global trends of salinity. So I believe it's just an adjustment of the model, which is especially evident over the first two cycles. But the important point that I would like to make is that if we look at the variability in the you know, over the years where we have observations, this variability reproduces the variability in the observations very well. So we have this increase in freshwater content between the early 2000 to about 2010, and where we have this double peak that we can also see in the blue bars here between 2010 and 2018 approximately. So that's important. So the last metric for the Arctic is sea ice. So these are the trends and these are the climatological biases, okay? So for the trends, so left panels, these are the three curves, one next to the other. I think it's blue, black, and the light pink. Those are model results, and I just plotted the three cycles, one on top of the other, so that I can compare with observations. And so the observations SSMI are the green curves in the top panel, and biomass reanalysis is in the lower panel. So the top panel, I didn't say, is aggregated sea ice area for over the whole Northern Hemisphere for February and September, and the lower panel is aggregated sea ice volume. So you can see that with observations or reanalysis data, we tend to have a volume that is overestimated most of the times. The trends are well represented. You have this downward trend from the 1990s to the 2000s for both summer and winter, I would say. So when we look at the climatological biases with respect to SSMI for ice concentration and with respect to ISAT for ice thickness, then you see that the main problem here is sea ice, that we have too thick sea ice in the Beaufort gyre and the East Siberian Sea in winter, and maybe a little bit of an underestimate in the Kara Sea in October, November. So we are we are finding that perhaps tuning the sea ice parameter that basically it changes the amount of energy dissipation within the ice dynamics. Perhaps we can improve the sea ice thickness. Okay, so the only one metric that I would like to show in terms of global perspective is the MOC, because we are really interested what a lot of the questions that we're interested about is about impacts on the MOC. So as you can see, both the 60-10 and the 60-6 compare to the rapid array value of about 17 sphere group. They're both underestimating it. So we have about 11 sphere group. So this is something that we need to definitely improve upon. So for the future, so a lot of the science questions that I have mentioned need to be investigated under a coupled experiment. So the natural next step it will be to couple the ocean sea ice Arctic meshes with the atmosphere. So we will start with coupling with standard resolution atmosphere and land. And then at the same time, we are exploring coupling with an Arctic region refined atmosphere E3SM mesh. And this is the collaboration with Erica Ressler, Sandia, and then Jiandong Zhang and John Walsh at University of Alaska Fairbanks. So they are working under another DOE-funded project looking at impacts of sea ice on storms. So these are typical patterns of storms into the Arctic from the Pacific and the Atlantic. And so this is a possible candidate for an Arctic region refined atmosphere mesh. So you have a resolution changing from 1 degree in the lower latitudes, I'm sorry, in the mid latitudes towards 1/4 degree in this area where the storms are found. So this is mostly it. I have some, instead of having a summary, I just wanted to put there some discussion points. To encourage questions or discussion. So the models with horizontal resolution that can be refined regionally are nice, as Wilbert mentioned. They can reproduce certain features well at a fraction of the cost that is needed to run a global high resolution simulation. There are some caveats that we can discuss, but I don't need to, of course, remind this audience that some bias don't just improve with resolution, and also there are questions remain about where we want to refine the resolution and to what degree. So our approach is to basically focus on the processes and the metrics that are important for the science questions that we care about. And so, for example, I've talked about the biases in the stratification. That's most probably a bias of the model. It's not improving or changing with the resolution. So we have to understand if that's important to us, we have to understand why we have them and try to improve them. There's other the MOC, for example, there are some indications that if we resolve the western boundary currents better, we can improve on the MOC. So high resolution may help there. And it's also important for us to reproduce variability over the last 40 years or so. So these things we basically need to keep, because we can have, of course, the model perfect. There is no such a thing. So these are our priorities. So with that, I would like to thank you again and open it to questions.
All right, terrific, Milena. Thanks very much. I propose that we go to Colin's talk first and then open a discussion. These are some really good points that we can discuss later. But I propose to go to Colin's presentation first. So Colin, do you want to share your slide?
I can when Milena releases the screen.
So I do stop share. Okay.
Perfect. Okay, and you guys can see these slides?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
All right, great. Thanks for the opportunity to kind of chat with you guys today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of other side of the coin, I suppose, than what Milena just discussed, which was the, so we're going to be talking about the atmospheric component of regionally refined modeling. And I do want to highlight that while I'm talking about this today, I am not a high latitude modeler by classical training. Adam Harrington, who's a ASP postdoc at NCAR, has actually been working a lot kind of on these configurations. After I left NCAR a few years ago, he's been kind of taking a lot of the workflow and moving that forward with regard to variable resolution options in CESM. So a lot of what I'm going to show today really couldn't have been done without his analysis. So just to give kind of a really quick motivator, this is probably not the type of audience that really needs that motivation, but I'd love to show this to my students, you know, this idea of what model resolution in the atmosphere buys you. So this is a particular phenomenon that, you know, we've simulated at 4 degree spatial resolution. You know, 4 degrees is relatively coarse, but we can move down kind of 1, 2 degrees. Those are kind of the spatial resolutions we're talking about with, you know, CMIP6 models, for example. And the structural representation of this particular feature starts to kind of stand out, but we can still see that we really don't have a lot of that fine scale dynamical information that we're really interested in capturing. And it's only when we move through kind of this finer spectrum of grid spacing, moving down 1/4 degree, 1/8 degree, that we really begin to capture a lot of these kind of atmospheric aspects that are associated with extreme weather. So in this particular case, this is Hurricane Sandy, a hindcast of Hurricane Sandy actually in CESM from a few years ago, making landfall. But it's really emphasizing and driving home the point that this spatial resolution it can be very important to us in the atmosphere because it gives us a better physical representation of all sorts of aspects of the system: transient eddies, land surface processes, orography, which is a big one that we'll talk about today, as well as extreme weather. And then, you know, kind of tying this all together is, you know, traditionally we've kind of operated in these 2 paradigms that, you know, you had your kind of weather modelers, maybe this is regional climate modeling or numerical weather prediction, where kind of the grid spacings you were focused on were relatively fine, maybe on the order of 10, 20, 30 kilometers. You know, but you had to kind of make some trade-offs, generally simulation length, for example, if you're interested on the climate side. Whereas climate models generally haven't had that fine spatial resolution to essentially see these features that kind of have this degree of societal relevance, but also kind of better representation that can further kind of improve our understanding of the climate system. But lately, there's been a large blurring kind of this line. These communities have sort of started to meet in the middle. These bridges kind of have been built. And one of the techniques that we've been using to kind of try to bring these kind of paradigms together is this idea of variable resolution modeling. So I'm not going to give kind of a really detailed introduction to exactly what's going on in the model, but mostly just to hammer home that there are a lot of benefits that we can gain from this idea of using these kind of unstructured meshes that have grid spacing that kind of varies as a function of where you are in the globe. So one big thing that is inherent actually in both the CESM model now, as well as E3SM, is the grid discretization is actually on what we call a cube sphere grid, which is exactly essentially what it sounds like if we put a cube inside the Earth and we kind of projected it out onto the surface. But a big thing for high latitude modeling is this kind of gets us away from the issue of the polar singularity. So getting us such that we don't have to do some sort of specific filtering, we don't have any sort of convergence that's going on as a function of moving to higher resolution. And this makes it really easy for us to have kind of these variable resolution conforming quadrilateral meshes in this case. And really, you know, as Milena pointed out, this really allows us to kind of have to target those resources into a particular region that we're interested in. So it allows us to kind of take our computing capabilities and kind of hone them in on a particular aspect of the climate system. And, you know, we've already been using these architectures, these grids, quite a bit in the past, I would say 5, 6, 7 years or so. Generally, the focus has been kind of more on this mesoscale or extreme cyclonic, you know, research area. So we've used this a lot for tropical cyclones and mid-latitude extratropical cyclones. But I don't want to talk about that today. Again, we want to kind of focus on the higher latitudes. And it's also important to note that these models are designed to be scalable. So the kind of the buzz term I like to use is that this allows us to use kind of these next generation computing architectures, whether they're at NERSC or NCAR Cheyenne system, or even some of these larger university clusters that are coming online. to kind of access some of these data products that were kind of historically unavailable to us and allow us to kind of achieve answers to some of these grand challenges that have been proposed. So just kind of the one slide note on computational notes before I get into some results here. So all the simulations I'm going to show today use the community Earth system model and version 2, and we're using the spectral element dynamical core in the model. And this, for those of you who are more familiar with E3SM, is the same dynamical core. It's referred to as home, or it's the same dynamical core in EAM. So there's actually a lot of DNA that's shared between the two atmospheric components of the model. But the big thing I want to note here is kind of the cost savings or the cost benefit analysis essentially that you would have to do with a variable resolution model. So on this previous slide, these are two configurations that are actually going to be released in the next version of CESM, the incremental release of CESM2. On the top here, we have this refined Arctic grid where we have approximately 1/4 degree, 25-kilometer grid spacing over the polar cap and 1 degree conventional grid spacing everywhere else. And then this kind of subgrid here, which we call Arctic GRIS, which is essentially the GRIS acronym is meant to target the Greenland ice sheet. So we actually go down to another step of 14-kilometer resolution over that. And you can actually kind of approximate the computational costs, and you can validate these with simulations. But essentially, one constraint we have is the time step of the model is constrained by the finest grid spacing due to the CFL constraint. But that the cost of the model scales with the number of cells in your mesh. So we would expect these simulations to be more expensive than kind of a traditional 1 degree model because of extra grid cells and the constrained time step, but also much cheaper than the global high resolution models because we have fewer degrees of freedom that we need to simulate. So one just example I just plucked out of our scaling run so far. So this Arctic grid, so looking at this top grid up here, with the 25-kilometer grid spacing over the polar cap, that is 9 times more expensive than your traditional kind of 1 degree CMIT 6 class simulation, but it's 6 times cheaper than kind of the standard CESM, E3SM high-res global, 1/4 degree run that might be in like high-res MIP, for example. So this really does allow for a trade-off for additional ensemble members or longer simulation lengths. So for the remainder of this, I really want to kind of just show some preliminary results of some simulations that we've done with a couple of these grid configurations and kind of assessing the performance and what resolution actually buys us in the Arctic and why we're kind of really excited to have these capabilities. So this is from a paper published last year from Leo van Kampenhout. And one of the things that we were interested in looking at was, did refinement significantly degrade a simulation? So I like to joke that the Hippocratic Oath of being a variable resolution climate modeler is the first rule is you really don't want to hurt the simulation by adding resolution. And in fact, with older configurations of CESM, that's actually what we did because of issues with the scalability of the parameterization. So we always, as a first cut, want to make sure that we're not, these large resolved synoptic scales, we're not significantly degrading with resolution. And this plot is really just showing that when we think about these kind of large scales, when you're talking about wave number 1, 2, kind of in the Northern Hemisphere, that adding the refinement doesn't really take away anything that the model should already be able to capture at 1 degree resolution. So for example, the low resolution on the left, high resolution on the right, 500 millibar geopotential height on top and surface temperature on the bottom. This is June, July, and August because we were looking at Greenland surface mass balances at the time. But really the big take home here is that in general, the left and the right look the same. So adding that resolution is not really fundamentally changing kind of that really large scale mean climate. In fact, we only see a little bit of hatching of differences. These are statistically significant, and they actually occur over areas of orography where the simulated topographical fields vary between the two configurations, but those kind of large, well-resolved synoptic scales look very similar between the two configurations, which is something that we're always happy to see. So one of the big improvements with variable resolution models in the atmosphere is orographic representation, so orographic forcing, especially when we're talking about mid and high latitudes. So these are just 2 transects we have over Greenland, the B transect on the top and the K transect on the bottom. And then in the left panel, this is just what the model representation of orography would look like. So you can imagine this is, the black curve is kind of your observed orographic field as a function along this transect. And then the colored contours are kind of that discrete resolution, so what the model actually sees. And again, not to belabor this point, but on the left side with this 1 degree model, you see this much blockier structure. You kind of get a lot of clipping with extremes and sharper gradients in the orographic field. And what that higher resolution allows you to do is kind of have a better representation of that surface forcing, that surface boundary condition associated with the orography. So one of the big features that we're looking at when we're looking at high latitude simulations in orography is obviously precipitation, and precipitation that is kind of forced by the topology of the surface. So this is just a really broad way of kind of looking at this, but this is just mean annual precipitation, again, from Leo's paper last year. And we have three plots here. So this is mean annual precipitation from the traditional kind of 1 degree model, one of these regionally refined models with 25 quarter degree resolution over Greenland, and then kind of this RACMO data set. So we could say this is 11 kilometer resolution, but we're treating this kind of as our observational reference and our observational truth. And I'm sure you guys could actually look at more features specifically than I could. Some of the things that we flagged though in the manuscript, for example, this drying over the mid and especially northern part of Greenland is improved with resolution. So as we move from A to C, it looks a lot more like D. And the other big thing is a lot of this orography around the margins of Greenland as well as the ice sheet. Because we're kind of getting a better structure of that surface forcing, we're also getting a better representation of uplift of near surface winds that are kind of driving these precipitation maxima that we see that are associated with kind of these gradients along the coastline. As far as kind of the low-level flow goes, so this is what I like to refer to as the eye candy part of the presentation. So hopefully this shows up okay on Zoom via the bandwidth. But this is a movie of streamline. So you could think of this as wind at the lowest model level over a single winter. So we're plotting this every 6 hours essentially to watch the evolution of the wind field. And then on the left, you have kind of your traditional 1 degree model. And on the right, you have this kind of a higher resolution model. And again, what you see is a lot more of this kind of structure, especially along the coastlines. We're doing a much better job of resolving these katabatic winds, kind of, especially again, around the edges of Greenland and the ice sheet margins. And we're actually starting to validate these against field campaign data to kind of see what kind of bang for the buck that we get out of this. But preliminary assessments have showed that these improvements are credible, that these are things that are more realistic and we would expect to be simulating in the model. So that's also a good sign. And then for the last couple of slides, I just want to talk about the potential for using resolution to reduce bias in the model. So one example here is now on the top, I'm actually showing the 14 kilometer minus the 28 kilometer DJF temperature difference at a bunch of different levels. So 2 meter temperature, 800 millibars, 500 millibars, and 100 millibars. So this is kind of, you can imagine this is the change in the temperature we get moving up in resolution. And one of the things we've had in CESM2 is in the standard 1 degree model, we actually have this cold bias over the Baffin Bay, the Labrador Sea, over Greenland, generally associated with winter months. And one thing we've seen with these higher resolution simulations is we actually see kind of a warming and a reduction of that bias. And what we can do is we can look at kind of a variety of metrics, a variety of proxies. We can see that this resolution is kind of resulting in a weakening of a high latitude, semi-persistent, low pressure system that's allowing for kind of this additional southerly flow. So this red here being southerly flow that kind of is warming this region and reducing this bias. So, and then on the, it's just highlighting what we were just talking about. And then on the next slide, this is kind of thinking about mechanisms for this. So one hypothesis we've come up with is well, is this a blocking response? So what we can do is we can actually use a blocking detection algorithm. So this is one from one of Paul Ulrich's students, Marielle Canero, that she published in 2019. We've implemented it in this Tempest Extremes package that we use for kind of quantification of climate extremes. But the big thing here is what we're actually doing is we're increasing the frequency of blocking. So in all of these cases, these are all various ways of looking at high resolution minus low resolution. This is 25 kilometers minus 200 kilometers. But we have the 14 kilometer minus the 100 kilometer. We see an increase in this DJF blocking, and we hypothesize that that's a result of kind of our better resolved structure of Greenland and kind of these Rossby scale waves essentially that we have in the Northern Hemisphere. And this increase in DJF blocking west of Greenland is consistent with the weakening of the stationary low that we saw in the previous slide. So this is a case where we believe that resolution itself is actually providing a more dynamically consistent simulation, which is helping lead to kind of the reduction of a persistent bias that we really have been struggling with in CESM2 for quite a while now. And so just in summary, variable resolution models, again, as we saw earlier, as well as in this talk, I think they offer kind of these interesting computationally efficient mechanisms for more accurately simulated processes. We have a couple of these configurations that the plan is to get them out the door with the next incremental CESM2 release, hopefully within the next 6 months. It's important to note for the E3SM modelers in the crowd that, again, since the two models share a lot of DNA, it's actually relatively straightforward. It's more of a data generation exercise to move these configurations back and forth between the models. If you're an E3SM modeler that's kind of interested in these type of configurations, there's definitely pipelines we can work on. And I know Erica, who's also on the call, has been doing a lot of work with E3SM at high latitudes and this kind of work as well. We found that refinement improves precipitation, resolve drainage, katabatic winds, as well as blocking. But these are only just kind of a very cursory look at things right now. And that said, there are many challenges and there are many good points for discussion, some of which were brought up on the previous talk. So it's kind of nice to see that these operate in different components of the Earth system. But one real big challenge with these multi-resolution models is scale-aware physics. So are the parameterizations that we have behaving well in a 100 kilometer grid cell and then also behaving well in a 14 kilometer grid cell? Because again, we don't want to be harming our simulations with resolution. And this also emphasizes that resolution isn't necessarily a silver bullet. We can't just throw degrees of freedom at the problem and expect a better simulation. And then another big question is, where do we want to refine? So in certain places, like in Greenland, we've really focused on this idea of local refinement and put high resolution over kind of the region we care about. But in other cases, it might be looking at more the upstream flows or kind of global teleconnections. And I think that's something that's more of an art than a science right now, but requires a lot more nuanced expertise from other atmospheric modelers. So with that, I'll wrap up.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Colin. It was a really nice presentation and a very nice compliment to Milena's presentation about the ocean sea ice. So we're kind of running out of time. We have only 5 minutes left. So I propose to not do the community updates. So if you have something to share with the community, then please put it in the chat box or in the comment box that is associated with our meeting website. But let's open the floor for questions for either Milena or Colin.
Yeah, there were 2 questions in the chat box, one from Phil and one from Wislav. So if you want to speak up and just ask away.
Okay, well, this is Phil, and I had one question for Milena and one question for Colin. And I think Colin actually answered the question, but I'll repeat it anyway. For Milena, it was just to ask whether she initially showed some of the volume transports for the 60 to 10 and 60 to 6 resolutions, and I was interested in whether or what the volume transports looked like for the default MPAS resolutions, the 30 and 60 kilometer resolutions, just whether those volume transports are dramatically different when driven with the reanalysis products.
Yeah, it depends on the simulation. I've seen some low resolution E3SM simulations that they even They even have a reverse, but for the simulation that I was showing, they are not too bad. The only one that looks off, for example, is that Davis Strait, and that might be due to the fact that the low resolution V1 mesh for E3SM has narrow strait that's closed. So yeah, so it depends on the E3SM simulation.
Okay. And then for Colin, it was just, he dealt with it on his last slide, but it was just to ask whether he thought that the atmospheric parameterizations were now sufficiently scale aware or resolution dependent that they could deal with getting a reasonable tuning for a model where the resolutions can change so dramatically between one part of the globe and the rest.
Yeah, Phil, I think that's an excellent question. And I think it's actually still kind of an open question. Generally, a lot of the focus with the resolution sensitivity has been on like the convective parameterization, things that are more impactful at low latitudes. The nice thing with refinement at mid and high latitudes is we've generally found that it's more of a forced environment. So the dynamical core does a lot more of the heavy lifting. But I think there's still definitely a lot of room to explore things like boundary layer parameterization. So we have a project right now looking at club to see kind of how those are behaving across scales in the Arctic environment.
Thank you.
And then just to quickly answer Wisła's question, as far as the resolution, so we are running, these simulations that I showed were all uncoupled, so that all of the forcing, well, they're coupled to an active land and ice model, but the ocean model is a prescribed data ocean. But via the seam coupler, we could actually couple a variety of different model configurations. So within ES3SM, for example, you could run the same configurations that Milena was talking about, but underneath the regionally refined configuration. So with the proper kind of mapping files, those can kind of all be run. But we've pretty much been explicitly focused on a lot of kind of constrained simulations to just make sure that we're really focusing on atmospheric biases and we're not conflating anything.
Thank you.
That's okay. That's a question.
This is Hailo. I just have a quick question for Milena about the horizontal resolution for oceanic processes. For example, the convections. Does those parameterizations have a dependence on the horizontal resolution? Is that the optimal one?
No, no, not in this run. So no. So you ask whether the vertical parameterization, the vertical mixing.
Yeah, the aspect ratio. I know that your vertical resolution is fixed. So is there optical horizontal resolution to match with the vertical one?
No, not that I am aware.
Okay, thanks.
So what we are, so the newest development in terms of parameterizing the eddies, so that's where we are, so we're including basically a GM parameterization that varies horizontally and vertically, depending on the stratification, basically. But that's not also new development that is not included in this first simulation that we have.
Caitlin?
Yeah, thank you for the nice presentations. I don't know if I've used the word orography very often, Colin, so thanks for adding that to my vocabulary. Also, it's funny, as somebody who's spent some time near the K-transect, to think of that as an orographic effect. I'm used to thinking about mountains that are a lot bigger than the relief there on the ice sheet. But yeah, great presentations both. And my question is about EPSM and whether or not it's possible to partition freshwater input. So across some of the volume exchange of water across those gates, is it possible to partition that freshwater from, you know, Y% from the Greenland ice sheet and Z% from Arctic glaciers.
Yeah, no, I mean, unless you use some, some diagnostics, right? So, so for example, Jashu Jang, she's also on the call. She's been looking at how freshwater from the buffer gyre is released, and then in a different model. And so she tags specific tracers that are sort of dependent on salinity. And so that's how she does the tagging. We don't have that in E3SM in Impasse Ocean yet. So, and unless you think of some specific diagnostics, you can you can't really tag freshwater input.
Milena, just to add to this is Matt. I have a student right now who is starting to add some of that stuff into Impasse Ocean. In fact, using the Bamber Greenland ice sheet runoff data separately from the other freshwater inputs. So like Milena said, it's not part of the code right now, but it's being developed.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
Great, thank you.
All right, we're a couple of minutes after the hour, so maybe we should wrap up this discussion. But if you want to reach out to Milena or Colin, then just send an email. I'll put something in the chat box, the comment box on the website for this meeting. That's also very much appreciated. So for next month, I don't think we have anything on the calendar yet. So last week we had the IARPA team lead meeting, and we're still developing our agenda for the coming year. So stay tuned. Renew, is there anything you want to close the session with?
Yeah, thanks, Gilbert. I just want to thank the speakers and for the excellent talk. And it is really nice to see the variable resolution models in, being used and developed and used. And I think it's really interesting. And there's a lot more of work that will show up in the future. So thank you with respect to the talk, and look forward to you at the next IARPA modeling meeting.
Thanks, everyone.